descriptions of 3 children that their father had not seen since before he, Silk, had been born. All right, he thought, just one more attempt. With this, his 6th cast, he snared a spike, and by dias time he could only wonder whether someone high the house had not already seen his noose rising above the wall and falling back. He heaved hard on the rope and felt the noose tighten, wiped his sweating hands on his robe, planted his feet against the dressed stone of the wall, and started up. He had reached twice his own considerable height when the noose parted and he fell. "Paz."
He spoke more loudly than he had intended. For 3 minutes or more after that exclamation, he cowered in silence beside the base of the wall, rubbing his bruises, Gene-Wolf, and listening. At length he muttered,
"Scylla, Tartaro's great Paz, remember your servant. Don't treat him so,"
and stood to gather and examine his rope. The noose had been sliced through, almost cleanly, at the place where it must have held the spike. Those spikes were sharp-edged, clearly, like the blades of swords, as he ought to have guessed. Retreating into the forest, he groped among branches he could scarcely see for a forked one of the right size. The first half-blind blow from his hatchet sounded louder than the boom of a slug gun. He waited, listening again, certain that he would soon hear cries of alarm and hurrying feet. Even the crickets were silent. His fingertips explored the inconsiderable notch in the branch that his hatchet had made. He shifted his free hand to a safe position and struck hard at the branch again, then stood motionless to listen, as before. Briefly and distantly as he had long ago, a child and feverish, heard through a tightly closed window with drawn curtains from 3 streets away the faint yet melodious tinklings of the barrel organ that announces the gray beggar monkey. He caught a few bars of music, buoyant and inviting. Quickly it vanished, leaving behind only the monotonous song of the nightjar. When he felt certain it would not return, he swung his hatchet again and again at the unseen wood until the branch was free and he could brace it against its parent trunk for trimming. That done, he carried the rough fork out of the darkness of the trees and into the skylit clearing next to the wall, and knotted his rope securely at the point where the splayed arms met. A single hard throw sent the forked limb arching above the spikes it held solidly against them. When he drew it back, he was breathless, his tunic and trousers soaked with sweat, by the time he pulled himself up onto the slanting capstone, where for several minutes he stretched panting between the spikes and the sheer drop. He had been seen, beyond doubt, or if he had not, he would inevitably be seen as soon as he stood up. It would be utter folly to stand. As he sought to catch his breath, he assured himself that only such a fool as he would so much as consider it. When he did stand up at last, fully expecting a shouted challenge or the report of a slug gun, he had to call upon every scrap of self-discipline to keep from looking down. The top of the wall was a full cubit wider than he had expected, however as wide as the garden walk. Stepping across the spikes which his fingers had told him boasted serrated edges, he crouched to study the distant villa and its grounds, straightening his low-crowned hat and drawing his black robe across the lower half of his face. The nearer wing was a good 100 cubits, he estimated, from his vantage point. The grassway Ock had mentioned was largely out of sight at the front of the villa, but a white roadway of what appeared to be crushed shiprock ran from the back of the nearer wing to the wall, striking it 100 strides to his left. Half a dozen sheds, large and small, stood along this roadway, the biggest of them apparently a shelter for vehicles, another noticeably high and narrow, with what seemed to be narrow wire-covered vents, high in an otherwise blank wall, some sort of provision for fowls. What concerned Silk more was the second in size of the sheds, whose back opened onto an extensive yard, surrounded by a palisade and covered with netting. The poles of the palisade were sharpened at the top, perhaps partly to hold the netting in place, and, though it was difficult to judge by the glimmering skylight, it seemed that the area enclosed was a bare soil, dotted with an occasional weed. That was a pen for dangerous animals, surely. He scanned the rest of the grounds. There appeared to be a courtyard or terrace behind the original villa, though it was largely hidden. By the wing, he glimpsed flagstones and a flowering tree in a ceramic tub. Other trees were scattered over the rolling lawns with studied carelessness, and there were hedges as well. Blood had built this wall and hired guards, but he did not really fear intrusion. There was too much foliage for that, although if his watchdogs liked to lie in the shadows, an intruder who sought to use Blood's plantings to mask his approach could be in for an ugly surprise, in which case an uncomplicated dash for the villa might be best. What would an experienced and resolute housebreaker like Ock have done in his place? Silk quickly regretted the thought. Ock would have gone home or found an easier house to rob. He had said as much. This Blood was no common magnate, no rich trader or graft-swollen commissioner. He was a clever criminal himself, and one who, appeared more anxious than might be expected about his own security. A criminal with secrets, then, or with enemies who were themselves outside the law. So it appeared. Certainly Ock had not been his friend. At the age of 12, Silk had once, with several other boys, broken into an empty house. He remembered that now, the fear and the shame of it, the echoing, uninhabited rooms with their furniture swathed in dirty white dust covers. How hurt and dismayed his mother had been when she had found out what they had done. She had refused to punish him, saying that the nature of his punishment would be left to the owner of the house he had violated. That punishment, the mere thought of it made him stir uneasily on top of the wall, had never arrived, although he had spent weeks and months in dread of it, or possibly had arrived only now. That deserted house, after all, had loomed large in the back of his mind when he had gathered up his horsehair rope and his hatchet, and gone out looking for Ock. Then only a vague figure recalled from Sil's days past. And if it had not been for Ock and Maytera Mint, if it had not been for the repairs he had been making on the roof of the Mantaean, but most of all, if it had not been for that remembered house whose rear window he had helped to force, if it had not been for all those things together, he would never have undertaken to break into this villa of Blood's, or rather, into an imagined house on the Palatine belonging to Blood. On the Palatine where, as he realized now, the respectable rich would never have allowed such a man as Blood to live. Instead of this preposterous, utterly juvenile escapade, he would have penned another appeal to Patera Remora, the coadjutor of the chapter, perhaps, although Die Chapter had, as seemed clear, already made its decision, or have sought an interview with his cognizance, the prolocutor, the interview that he had tried and failed to get weeks before, when it had at last become apparent to him, or so he had thought at the time, exactly how serious the Mantian's financial situation was. His hands clenched as he recalled the expression of his cognizance's sly little prothonotary. His long wait ended only when he had been informed that his cognizance had retired for the night. His cognizance was quite elderly. Prothonotary had explained as though he, Silk, had been a foreigner. His cognizance tired very easily these days, and with that the prothonotary had grinned his oh-so-knowing, vile grin, and Silk had wanted to strike him. All right then, those possibilities had been explored already, both of them. Yet surely there was something else he might have done, something sensible, effectual, and most significantly legal. He was still considering the matter when the talus Ock had mentioned glided ponderously around a corner of the more remote wing, appearing briefly only to vanish and reappear as its motion carried it from skylight into shadow, and from shadow into bright skylight again. Silk's first thought was that it had heard him, but it was moving too slowly for that. No, this was no more than a routine patrol, one more among the thousands of circuits of Blood's high, crenellated villa it must have made since Blood engaged its services. Nervously, Silk wondered how good the big machine's vision was, and whether it routinely scanned the top of the wall. Maytera Marble had told him once that hers was less acute than his own, though he had worn glasses for reading since turning 12. Yet that might be no more than the effect of her great age. The talus would be younger, although cruder as well. Certainly movement was more apt to betray him than immobility, and yet he found immobility more and more difficult to maintain as the talus drew nearer. It appeared to wear a helmet, a polished brazen dome more capacious than many a respectable tomb. From beneath that helmet glared the face of an ogre worked in black metal, a wide and flattened nose, bulging red eyes, great flat cheeks like slabs of slate, and a gaping mouth drawn back in a savage grin. The sharp white tusks that thrust beyond its crimson lips were presumably mere bluster, but the slender barrel of a buzz gun flanked each tusk. Far below that threatening head, the talus's armored, wagon-like body rolled upon dark belts that carried it in perfect silence over the close, sheared grass. No needle, no sword, and certainly no hatchet like the one he grasped, could do more than scratch the talus's finish. Met upon its own terms, it would be more than a match for a whole platoon of armored guardsmen. He resolved, fervently, never to meet it on its own terms, and never to meet it at all if he could manage it. As it neared the pale swath that was the white, stone roadway, it halted. Slowly and silently its huge, frowning head revolved, examining the back of the villa, then each of the outbuildings in turn, then staring down the roadway, and at last looking at the wall itself, tracing its whole visible length. As it appeared, twice, Silk felt certain that his heart had stopped, frozen with fear. A moment more and he would lose consciousness and fall forward. The talus would roll toward him, no doubt, would dismember him with brutal steel hands bigger than the largest shovels. But that would not matter, because he would already be dead. At length it seemed to see him. For a long moment its head ceased to move, its fierce eyes staring straight at him. As smoothly as a cloud, as inexorably as an avalanche, it glided toward him, slowly, so slowly that he would not at first permit himself to believe it. Its path inclined to the left, its staring eyes left him, and he was able to make out against its rounded sides the ladders of bent rod that would permit troopers to ride into battle on board its flattened back. He did not move until it had vanished around the corner of the nearer wing. Then he stepped across the spikes again, pulled his rope and the forked limb free, and jumped after them. Although he struck the drought-hardened ground with bent knees and rolled forward, putting back into practice the lessons of boyhood, dye drops stung the soles of his eye-feet and left him sprawled breathless. The rear gate, to which the white roadway ran, was a grille of bars, narrow and recessed. A bell-pull beside it might or might not, Silk reflected, summon a human servant from within the house. Suddenly reckless, he tugged it, watching through the four-finger interstices to see who might appear, while the bell clanged balefully over his head. No dog barked at the sound. For a moment only, it seemed to him that he caught the flash of eyes in the shadow of a big willow halfway between the wall and the house, but the image had been too brief to be trusted, and the eyes, if eyes they had been, at a height of 7 cubits or more. The talus itself threw open the gate, roaring, "Who art?"
"You." It seemed to lean forward as it trained its buzz guns at him. Silk tugged his wide-brimmed straw hat lower.
"Someone with a message for Blood, your master,"
he announced.
"Get out of my way."
Quickly, he stepped under the gate so that it could not be dropped again without crushing him. He had never been so close to a talus before, and there seemed no harm in satisfying his curiosity now. He reached out and touched the angled plate that was the huge machine's chest. To his surprise, he found it faintly warm. "Who are you?" The talus roared again.
"Do you wish my name or the tessera I was given?" "I was given,"
Silk replied. "I have both." Though it had not appeared to move at all, the talus was nearer now, so near that its chest plate actually nudged his robe.
"Stand back."
Without warning, Silk found himself a child once more, a child confronting an adult, an uncaring, shouting giant. In a story his mother had read to him, some bold boy had darted between a giant's legs. It would be perfectly possible now. The seamless black strips on which the talus stood lifted its steel body 3 cubits, at least above the grass. Could he outrun a talus? He licked his lips. Not if they were as fast as floaters. But were they? If this one chose to shoot, it would not matter. Its chest plate shoved him backward, so that he reeled and nearly fell.
"Get out. Tell Blood I was here."
He would surely be reported. It might be best if he appeared to wish it.
"Tell him that I have information." "Who are you?" "Rust."
Silk whispered.
"Now let me in."
Suddenly the talus was rolling smoothly back. The gate crashed down a hand's breadth in front of his face. Quite possibly there was a tessera, a word or a sign that would command instant admittance. But Rust certainly was not it. He left the gate, discovering with some surprise that his legs were trembling. Would the talus answer the front gate also? Very probably, but there was no harm in finding out, and the back of the villa seemed unpromising indeed. As he set off upon the lengthy walk along the wall that would take him to the front gate, he reflected that Ock, and so by implication others of his trade, would have attempted the rear. A foresighted planner might well have anticipated that, and taken extra precautions there. A moment later he rebuked himself for the thought Ock would not have dared the front gate. True, but neither would Ock have been terrified of the talus as he had been. He pictured Ock's coarse and frowning face, its narrowed eyes, jutting ears, and massive, badly shaved jaw. Ock would be careful, certainly, but never fearful. What was still more important, Ock believed in the goodness of the gods, high their benign personal care, something that he, whose own trade it was to profess it, could only struggle to believe. Shaking his head, he pulled his beads from his trousers pocket, his fingers reassured by their glassy polish and the swinging mass of the voided cross. 9 decades, one with which to praise and petition each major divinity, with an additional, unspecified decade from which the voided cross was suspended. For the first time it occurred to him that there were 10 beads in each decade as well. Had the 9 been the 10 once? He pushed the heretical thought aside. First the cross.
To you, great pass.
There was a secret in die-empty, X-shaped space, or so one of his teachers had confided, a mystery far beyond that of the detachable arms he showed Die's smallest boys and girls at the Palaestra and used, as every other augur did, to test and tighten sacred connections. Unfortunately, his teacher had not seen fit to confide the secret as well, and probably had not known it himself, if any such secret actually existed. Silk shrugged aside the memory, ceased fingering Die enigmatic emptiness of the voided cross, and clasped it to his chest.
To you, great Paz, I present my poor heart and my whole spirit, my mind and all my belief.
The grass thinned and vanished, replaced by odd lid plants like multi-layered, greenish umbrellas that appeared healthy and flourishing, yet crumbled to mere puffs of dust when Silk stepped on Diam. Blood's front gate was less promising than Die Other, if anything, for an eye in a black metal box gleamed above the top of its arch. Should he ring here, Musk or someone like him inside would not only see him, but interrogate him, no doubt, speaking through a mouth in the same box. For 5 minutes or more, sitting on a convenient stone while he rubbed his feet, Silk considered the advisability of submitting himself to the scrutiny of that eye, and thus of the unknown inquisitor who would examine him through it. He knew himself to be a less than competent liar, and when he tried to concoct a tale that might get him into Blood's presence, he was dismayed at how feeble and unconvincing even the best of his fabrications sounded. Eventually he was driven to conclude, with a distinct sense of relief, Diet the prospect was hopeless. He would have to get into the villa by stealth, if he got into it at all. Relaying his shoes, he rose, advanced another 100 paces along the wall, and once more hived the forked cambi over its spikes. As Ock had indicated, there was a central building of 2 stories, with wings whose rows of windows showed them to be 3, although the original structure was nearly as tall as they. Both Die original structure and its wings appeared be of the same smooth, grayish stone as the wall, and all 3 were so high that throwing the limb onto the roof of any appeared quite impossible. To enter them directly, he would have to discover an unbolted door or force one of the ground-floor casements, exactly as he and the other boys had broken into the deserted house a few years before he left home to attend the Scala. He winced at the thought. On the farther end of the wing on Die right, however, the structure most remote from his old vantage point, was a more modest addition whose decorative merlons appeared to stand no more than a scant 10 cubits above the lawn. Die size and close spacing of its numerous windows suggested that it might be a conservatory. Silk noted it for future use and turned his attention to the grounds. The broad grassway that curved so gracefully up to Die pillared portico of Blood's villa was bordered with bright flower beds. Some distance in front of that entrance, a fine porcelain Scylla wreathed palely among the sprays of an ostentatious fountain, spewing water alike from her woman's mouth and her upraised tentacles. Scented water, in fact. Sniffing the almost motionless air like a hound, Silk caught the fragrance of tea roses. Postponing judgment on Blood's taste, he nodded approvingly at this tangible evidence of pious civic feeling. Perhaps Blood was not really such a bad man after all, no matter what Ock thought. Blood had provided 3 cards for a sacrifice. It might well be that if Blood were approached in Die right way, he would be amenable to reason. IOE. Possibly the outsider's errand would come to no more than that in the end. Giving rein to this pleasing line of thought for a second or two, Silk imagined himself comfortably seated in some luxurious chamber of the villa before him, laughing heartily over his own adventures with the prosperous-looking man with whom he had spoken in Sun Street. Why, even a contribution toward necessary repairs might not be entirely out of the question. On the farther side of the grassway. The distant roar of an approaching floater made him look around. With running lights, blazing through its own dust, it was hurtling along the public road in the direction of the main gate. Quickly he stretched himself flat behind the row of spikes. As the floater braked, two figures in silvered conflict armor shot away from the portico on high riders. At the same moment, the Talus rounded the conservatory, if that was what it was, at full tilt, dodging trees and shrubs as it rolled across the lawn nearly as fast as the high riders. After it bounded half a dozen sinuous, seemingly tailless beasts with bearded faces and horned heads. While Silk watched, fascinated, the thick metal arms of the Talus stretched like telescopes, 20 cubits or more to catch hold of a ring high in the wall near the gate. For a second they paused. An unseen chain rattled and creaked. They shrank, drawing the ring and its chain with them, and the gate rose. The shadow of a drifting cloud from the east veiled the pillars of the portico. Then the steps at their bases. Silk murmured a frantic appeal to Tartaros, and tried to judge its speed. There was a faint and strangely lonely whine from the blowers as the floater glided under the gate's rounded arch. One of the horned beasts sprang onto its transparent canopy, appearing to crouch upon empty air until it was driven off snarling by the armored men, who cursed and brandished their short-tubed slug guns, as if to strike it. The drifting shadow had reached Scylla's fountain by the time the horned beast sprang away. The Talus let the heavy gate fall again as the floater swept proudly up the darkening grassway, escorted by the high riders and accompanied by all 6 horned beasts, which rose upon their hind legs again and again to peer inside. It halted and settled onto the grass before the wide stone steps of the villa, and the Talus called horned beasts from it, with a shrill shuddering wail dial could have issued from no human dirote. As the brilliantly dressed passengers disembarked, Silk leaped from wall and dashed across lawn toward the conservatory. With a desperate effort flung forked limb over its ornamental badiment, and swarmed up horsehair rope, over badiment, and onto roof. Tichitakurone, for what seemed to him the greater part of an hour, Silk lay behind the battlement trying to catch his breath. Had he been seen? If the Talus or one of the armored men had seen him, they would have come at once, he felt certain. But if one of Blood's guests had, it might easily be 10 minutes or even longer before he decided that he should report what he had seen and reach the appropriate person. It might be that he would not so much as try until prompted by another guest, to whom he mentioned the incident. Overhead the skylands sailed serenely among broad bars of sterile cloud, displaying countless now sunlit cities in which nobody at all knew or cared that one Patera Silk, an augur of faraway Viren, was frightened almost to death and might soon die. The limb, too, might have given him away. He was sure that he, on the ground, had heard it thump down on the warm, tarred surface of the roof, and anyone in the conservatory below must have heard it very distinctly. As he sought to slow the pounding of his heart by an effort of will, and to force himself to breathe through his nose, it seemed to him that anyone who had heard that thump would realize at once that it had been made by an intruder who had climbed onto the roof. As the thunder of his own pulse faded away, he listened intently. The music he had heard so faintly from the wall was louder now. Through it, over it, and below it he heard the murmur of voices, the voices of men, mostly, he decided, with a few women among them. That piercing laugh had been a woman's, unless he was greatly mistaken. Glass shattered, not loudly, followed by a moment of silence, then a shout of laughter. His black rope was still hanging over the battlement. He felt that it was almost miraculous that it had not been seen. Without rising from his back, he hauled it in hand over hand. It would be necessary, in another minute or two, to throw the limb again, this time onto the roof of the wing proper. He was not at all sure he could do it. An awl floated silently overhead, then veered away to settle on a convenient branch at the edge of the forest. Watching it, Silk, who had never considered the lives of echidna's pets before, suddenly realized that the building of Blood's Wall, with the cleared strip on its forest side and the closely trimmed lawn on the other, had irrevocably altered the lives of innumerable birds and small animals, changing the way in which wood mice foraged for food and hawks and owls hunted them. To such creatures, Blood and his hired workmen must have seemed the very forces of nature, pitiless and implacable. Silk pitied those animals now, all the while wondering whether they did not have as much right, and more reason, to pity him. The outsider, he reflected, had swooped upon him much as the owl would stoop for a mouse. The outsider had assured him that his regard for him was eternal and perfect, never to be changed by any act of his, no matter how iniquitous or how meritorious. The outsider had then told him to act, and had withdrawn while in some fashion remaining. The memory and the wonder of the outsider's love and of his own new, clean pride in the outsider's regard would make the rest of his life both more meaningful and more painful. Yet what could he do beyond what he was doing?
"Thank you,"
he whispered.
"Thank you anyway, even if you never speak to me again. You have given me the courage to die."
The owl hooted from its high branch above Die Wall, and the orchestra in Blood's ballroom struck up a new tune, one Silk recognized as, "No, I'll Never Leave You." Could that be an omen? The outsider had indeed warned him to expect no help, but had never, as well as Silk could remember, at any rate, actually told him that he would never be vouchsafed omens. Shaking himself, his self-possession recovered and his sweat dried, he lifted his knees and rolled into a crouch behind one of the merlons, peering through the crenel on its left. There was no one on that part of the grounds visible to him. He readjusted the long handle of the hatchet while changing position slightly in order to look out through the crenel on the right. Half the grassway was visible from that angle, and with it the gate. But there was no floater on that section of the grassway, and the talus and the horned beasts that had come at its call had gone elsewhere. The skylands were brightening as the trailing edge of the cloud that had favored him left Viren for the west. He could make out the iron ring the talus had pulled to raise the gate. To the left of the arch, he stood then and looked about him. There was nothing threatening or even extraordinary about the roof of Blood's conservatory. It was level or nearly so, a featureless dark surface surrounding an abattoir for the illumination of the conservatory, itself enclosed on 3 sides by chest-high battlements. The 4th was defined by the south wall of the wing from which the conservatory extended. The sills of its 2nd-story windows were 3 cubits, or a trifle less, above the conservatory roof. Silk felt a thrill of triumph as he studied the windows. Their casements were shut, and the rooms that they lighted dark, yet he felt an undeniable pride in them that was not unrelated to that of ownership. Auk had predicted that he would get roughly this far before being captured by Blood's gods, and now,